De-globalization. It's a word which we're hearing a little more often these days, but it's still not as commonly heard as some other words like, just for an example, demonetization. There are words which tend to hit the headlines a little bit more often. But deglobalization is certainly an issue that is being discussed now. It has been a cause for concern. Is this global village becoming increasingly insular? Are we separating ourselves from each other? Now, we're also debating this on the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I, a global event if ever there was one. And I'm not sure how much we've learned from those terrible wars in terms of peace. But does globalization itself, would that help towards maintaining peace? If we become increasingly insular and nationalistic, is a chance of conflict just that much more? And finally, deglobalization, does it matter for India? Should we care? What is its impact on us? Lots of questions, and we have a fantastic panel to talk to us about this today for us to learn from. And judging by their achievements, I mean, talk about globalization. They've been all over the place, they've done everything. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what they have to say. We'll start by hearing from each of them in turn about their definition of globalization. Is it real? Is it here to stay? And we'll begin with you, sir, Mr. Jha, if you could just let us know what your thoughts are on this issue. Is deglobalization real?
Thank you, Maya. The word deglobalization to me is entirely new. It's a kind of a D. The fact that D is added means that it's sort of an anti, it's return. I don't believe that, yes, there is an attempt to fight globalization, which is not quite the same thing as deglobalization, because deglobalization implies success in fighting. And I am absolutely convinced that it is impossible to stop globalization, and that what we are really seeing is the last gasp of resistance from those who lose from globalization. Every major social change in history, for that matter even minor changes in a village, for example, creates winners and losers. There are new winners and new losers. And the people who are the winners and losers of the past suddenly find their positions changing very rapidly. And those who find themselves going down fight against it. And what we are seeing today in an attempt to, for example, reimpose tariffs, as Mr. Trump is doing, or use sanctions of varieties to in effect prevent you from trading with certain countries like Iran, for example. These are all attempts to prevent globalization. Therefore, it's first of all, it's very important to understand, therefore, what precisely globalization is in order to see why it is completely unstoppable. Globalization has been often, particularly in India, we confuse it with liberalization. The two are really quite different. Liberalization is a voluntary act of national governments, usually in trade, in the removal of exchange controls, and finally, to some extent, in the movement of capital flows, whose purpose is to increase production, increase output through trade. You import more, but you also export more, and increase efficiency in the process, and thereby improve the conditions of your people. So it is a move that actually starts in countries that want to improve their situation. And historically, liberalization began with countries that tried closed models of development in the 50s and 60s and found that they were an absolute disaster. Because the closed model of development, where you had high tariffs to protect your domestic markets, for example, the customs union in Germany, in 1848, that model was the model of the nation state. It was part of the building of the nation state, and for various reasons, it was also by the time that the Second World War finished and these new Asian countries began to industrialize, they began to realize that this is not working. And the first to realize that was Taiwan in 1957. The second was South Korea in 1962. And then it became a sort of a rush. If you remember, in the 60s and 70s, the World Bank did sponsored a series of studies, wonderful studies by Ian Little, Jagdish Bhagwati, and people like that, on various countries, on export-led growth. So the idea is, it is the country trying to develop which is doing this, and it's opening itself up to improve the lot of its people. Globalization, I'm afraid, is the exact opposite. Globalization is a simultaneous breaking down of barriers to movement of goods as well as of capital flows, nearly simultaneous. It hasn't come as a result of a desire to improve yourself. It's come because of internal pressures in the very nature of capitalism, which have forced these barriers down, the barriers of the nation state. What are those internal pressures? The internal pressures are the continuous expansion of the minimum size of efficient production in any industry at all, right across. And to a point where even the largest of the nation states, the USA, cannot any longer provide a large enough market in which to be able to efficiently have a complete economic system where every part of it is working at maximum efficiency. So because it's a technology-driven change, and it's a driven change, which forces open barriers. Now, globalization is the last of 4 such technology-driven changes in capitalism. We've seen this all before, and it's been pretty devastating. And I have to say one thing. I'll say it right now, and then I'll elaborate a moment. Each of these changes, from each of these shifts from a lower level of technological completeness to a higher level of technological completeness, has involved tremendous battles between the winners and losers and prolonged wars. And we have entered a phase of that right now. Capitalism, the origins was in northern Italy, in the northern Italian city-states. It was city-state capitalism, but even that Italian capitalism took 100 years of internecine war to establish, and it was finally established, peace was finally established in the Peace of Lodi in 1478. That made Italy the powerhouse of capitalism of that time. The second jump took place about 150 years later, in around about 1620 to 1650. And this was when the center of capitalism shifted from Italy to Amsterdam and Holland. And this shift, it's very complicated, I'm not going to go into all of this, was preceded by the 30-year war, which was at that time the most devastating war that the world had ever known. 200,000 people were killed in combat in that war. The whole of southern Germany, Belgium, etc., were laid waste. Southern Germany took 2 generations to recover to where they had been before the war. It was terrifying. It was the worst thing that had ever happened that humanity had known at that point. At the end of it, you had the Treaty of Westphalia, which was intended to say never again with another war like this. And the Treaty of Westphalia actually remained the basis of a peace between nations right up till the United Nations Charter of 1945. And it has only been destroyed now in the last 10 years, and in the era of globalization. Now, the third shift was from Amsterdam to London, and from a city-state to the first small nation-state capitalism. Again, I'm not going to go very far in this, but that one shift and the power that came from the technology that made it possible, notably the steam engine, made Britain in 1 year from an insignificant island on the fringe of Europe into the master of 1/4 of the world. That is the power of technology. That is what drove that. But eventually, quite a long time before we got to the even at the end of the 19th century, Britain was too small. So the colonization process was required in order to expand markets, railways across Canada, railways across America, railways across Australia, etc., 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 all to get raw materials, etc., and the whole structure was developed. And eventually, there was another period of tremendous war, First World War, and the Second World War, and the Holocaust in between, when the next jump took place, and America became the hegemonic power of the fourth phase of capitalism, as the largest single nation. And then, within relatively short time, between 1945 and 1975, the scale of technological expansion became so large that it could not be contained even within America. And then you had to break down the barriers and open up the whole world. Now, this has, of course, been promoted as a very good thing. But today we are now facing the problems that it is creating. One is, it's created winners and losers inside every country. Let's take the first thing is huge increase in income differentials. In 1971, the income differential in America between the lowest and the highest paid workers was 15-1. By 1991, it had gone to 300-1. In 2011, between 1971 and 2011, 90% of the total increase in wealth of America was captured by the top 10%. And 68% was captured by just the top 2%. In India, in the last 20 years, the dollar billionaires' share of Indian GDP has gone up from 3.5% to 22%. Did you know that there are a few, about 135 people or something who are dollar billionaires that control 22% of our GDP in India? I mean, we have to, so there are losers. Let me just go back to the larger issue of the losers in the world as a whole and leave India for a moment. Trade unionism, on the other hand, disappeared. The deindustrialization took place because industry moved to Asia. Deindustrialization didn't mean that industrial production went down. It meant that the number of people employed in industry went down. The proportion of the labor force in industry became smaller and smaller. The tax base therefore became smaller. But people lived longer, and the result was that you were trying to squeeze taxes out of a smaller and smaller store to feed a larger and larger class would need to be protected. Now, this is creating tremendous conflict. The deindustrialization of the poor, the disappearance of the blue-collar working class meant in America that they had to join the service industries. But the service industries were invaded by immigrants. And the same thing is happening in Europe now. So as a result of that, you now have racism, racial prejudice, racism, under a variety of pretexts emerging again. In a sense, the clock is being turned right back. Another thing that's happened, the freeing of the financial controls, the Big Bang of 1995, led to the rise of the worst robber baron class in history, and it was in the banking system. And today, I have a friend who's living today by selling in America, selling the shares that her grandfather gave her one by one of Exxon, another minute, and Exxon, what do you call it, what's that famous, that large, giant chemicals, the chemicals, Dow Chemicals and so on, because the money that she has at the bank gets her 0.25% interest. Now, 0.25% interest means that the entire haute bourgeoisie of Europe and America is being destroyed. You cannot live on on property income anymore. So the middle class is disappearing. So on the one hand, you have an impoverished poor. On the other hand, you have an absolutely merciless rich. And we are moving towards conflict. And all that Trump is doing is he's reflecting this. And he's trying to slow it down in his own way, in his own stupid, crazy way. But the point is, behind that is something genuine that is pushing, which we have to look at. And I'll just stop by saying one thing. There is only one solution to this. It's the Turbine Tax. I stop there.